At 9:12 on the morning of April 16th, 1947, a cargo ship vanished in a flash so bright that people across Galveston Bay saw fire moving through the sky. One moment, the French vessel Grandcamp was burning beside a crowded dock in Texas City. The next, the ship, the pier, the fire trucks, and hundreds of people around them were inside an explosion powerful enough to flatten buildings, throw molten steel across the port, and send a wall of water over the waterfront. The most horrifying part is that many of the people closest to the blast had come there to watch. The smoke rising from the Grandcamp was thick, strange, and brilliantly colored. Dock fires were not unusual in Texas City. Residents saw the smoke from their homes and workplaces. Some walked toward the harbor. Others drove down with friends or brought children close enough to see the firefighters working. They believed they were watching an ordinary ship fire. Inside the Grandcamp, roughly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer were heating inside enclosed cargo holds. The captain had ordered steam forced into the ship in an attempt to smother the flames without ruining the cargo. Instead, the heat continued to rise. The chemical carried its own oxygen. Fuel oil may have leaked into the burning holds. Most of the small arms ammunition stored elsewhere aboard the ship was still there. On the dock, Texas City's volunteer firefighters aimed hoses toward the vessel. The city's entire fire department had arrived. Then the Grandcamp exploded. Cargo, burning fertilizer, pieces of the ship, peanuts, tobacco, rope, fuel, and molten metal were launched thousands of feet into the air. A 15-foot wave struck the waterfront. A nearby chemical plant was destroyed. Railway warehouses collapsed. Oil tanks ignited. A barge was lifted out of the water and thrown onto land. Every one of Texas City's 27 firefighters was killed. But the disaster was not over. Another ship, the High Flyer, was moored nearby with approximately 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate and 2,000 tons of sulfur. The first explosion tore it loose and pushed it toward another vessel. Its crew tried to escape. Tugboats tried to move it. For hours, Texas City burned while rescuers searched for survivors, and the second ship remained trapped in the harbor. At 1:10 the next morning, the High Flyer exploded too. By the time the fires were finally controlled, more than 500 people were dead. Some estimates placed the number closer to 600. Thousands were injured, and many victims could never be identified with certainty. This was not a wartime attack. It happened in an American port during an ordinary working morning, when a substance believed to be little more dangerous than cement was handled beside homes, factories, rail lines, fuel tanks, and crowded docks. This is the true story of the Texas City disaster, the deadliest industrial accident in American history. And it began with a small fire hidden beneath a stack of fertilizer bags. In 1947, Texas City sat on the western shore of Galveston Bay, roughly 40 miles southeast of Houston. It was not a quiet coastal village. The city had grown around deep water shipping, rail connections, oil refineries, chemical production, and the promise of steady industrial work. The port connected inland factories and farms to the Gulf of Mexico. Ships arrived to load fuel, grain, chemicals, and manufactured goods. Trains moved constantly through warehouses near the docks. World War II had ended less than 2 years earlier. Across Europe, farms, cities, and industries were still struggling to recover. American goods were being shipped overseas in enormous quantities, including fertilizer intended to restore agricultural production. For many families in Texas City, the port represented security. Men worked as longshoremen, refinery employees, railway workers, mechanics, seamen, and plant operators. Their wages supported houses, shops, schools, and churches close to the industrial district. The boundary between the city and the port was thin. Homes stood within reach of the docks. Factories crowded the waterfront. Storage tanks filled with oil and chemicals rose beside railway lines and warehouses. The Monsanto chemical plant stood only a few hundred feet from the berth where the Grandcamp would later explode. The city had grown quickly, but its emergency services remained limited. Texas City had a volunteer fire department operating with only a few trucks. There was no functioning hospital prepared to receive thousands of casualties. There was no modern hazardous material response system. There was no centralized national disaster agency waiting to coordinate relief. And there was little public understanding of what thousands of tons of heated ammonium nitrate could do inside a ship. On Wednesday, April 16th, The weather was cool for the season. The morning temperature was around 56 degrees, with a strong wind blowing across the industrial waterfront. Workers reported for duty. Children went to school. Shops opened. Trains moved through the terminal. At Pier O, longshoremen returned to the Grandcamp to finish loading the cargo that would turn the harbor into a disaster zone. The Grandcamp was a former Liberty ship. Built during the Second World War, ships of this type had been produced rapidly to carry military supplies across the Atlantic. After the war, the vessel came under French ownership and was used for commercial cargo. Before reaching Texas City, the Grandcamp had made several stops. In Belgium, 16 wooden cases of small arms ammunition had been placed aboard. It later traveled through Cuba and Houston, carrying ordinary freight such as peanuts, tobacco, and twine. On April 11th, the ship arrived at Texas City and tied up at the north side of Pier O. Its main purpose there was to load ammonium nitrate fertilizer. The material had been produced in former American military plants in Iowa and Nebraska. It was packed into 100-pound paper bags and mixed with rosin to keep the granules from clumping. Rail cars carried the bags south to Texas. Some longshoremen later remembered that parts of the shipment felt warm when they arrived. By April 16th, approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate had been packed into cargo holds 2 and 4. The material was not treated as an explosive cargo. At the time, regulations were limited, inconsistent, and poorly enforced. To many workers and officials, ammonium nitrate was simply fertilizer. One railway executive later compared handling it to handling cement. That belief was understandable only if the chemical remained cool, uncontaminated, and away from a serious fire. Inside the Grandcamp, none of those conditions would last. Ammonium nitrate is not normally easy to ignite, but when strongly heated, confined, contaminated with combustible material, or exposed to a powerful initiating event, it can decompose violently. It can also release oxygen as it breaks down, allowing a fire to intensify even when outside air is limited. The Grandcamp's cargo was surrounded by other materials. There was fuel oil aboard the ship. There were wooden pallets and paper sacks. There were boxes of ammunition in another hold. And on the morning of April 16th, a fire began deep inside the fertilizer cargo. At about 8 o'clock, 8 longshoremen entered the Grandcamp to continue loading. Soon after going below deck, they smelled smoke. At first, there was no dramatic flame. The danger was hidden under layers of heavy fertilizer bags. Men removed several sacks and discovered a small fire 10 to 15 feet below the top of the cargo, close to the ship's hull. They tried to fight it with jugs of water. They used a portable extinguisher. The flames continued to spread. The fire was difficult to reach and surrounded by material that was already heating. At 8:25, the railway terminal sounded its siren. Texas City's fire department was called. 2 trucks arrived first. The other 2 followed. Fire Chief Henry Baumgartner and the city's volunteer firefighters moved hoses into position beside the ship. By then, the scene was already attracting attention. Smoke poured from the open hatches. Its unusual color made the fire appear almost spectacular. Residents could see it across town. Because dock fires had happened before, many people did not interpret the smoke as a warning to move away. They interpreted it as something to see. Workers left nearby buildings, drivers stopped, pedestrians gathered around the waterfront. Some spectators stood only a short distance from the firefighters. Photographers took pictures. The growing crowd had no way to understand that the ship was becoming a sealed chemical reactor. The Grandcamp also carried ammunition. 16 wooden boxes of small arms ammunition were stored in Hold 5, separated from the fire by a thin steel bulkhead. Workers were told to remove them. Each box weighed roughly 150 pounds. Only 3 had been lifted out before the first mate ordered everyone off the ship. The captain now faced a decision. Using large amounts of water risked damaging the valuable fertilizer cargo. So he chose a method commonly used for some shipboard fires: close the hatches and inject steam into the holds. The intention was to deprive the fire of oxygen. But ammonium nitrate does not depend entirely on oxygen from the surrounding air. As it decomposes under extreme heat, it can supply oxygen to the reaction. The steam did not cool the cargo enough. It may have contributed to dangerous chemical changes inside the holds. It also trapped heat. Pressure and temperature climbed inside the closed compartments. Fuel oil tanks located between cargo holds may have been damaged. allowing oil to leak into the hot fertilizer. The paper sacks, wooden material, fuel, and chemical cargo created an increasingly unstable mixture. Outside, firefighters sprayed water onto the vessel. The hull became hot, the smoke thickened, the color changed. People near the ship described popping sounds and pieces of burning material rising from the hold. The Grandcamp's captain and crew understood that the fire was worsening. The spectators did not. The port continued to function around them. Nearby workers remained in factories and warehouses. The Monsanto plant stood only about 300 feet away. The High Flyer and the Wilson B. Keene remained moored in neighboring slips. There was no mass evacuation. There was no exclusion zone large enough to protect the crowd. At 9:12 a.m., the reaction inside the Grandcamp reached its final stage. The detonation destroyed the ship almost instantly. For those nearest the pier, there was no meaningful interval between light, pressure, heat, and impact. The Grandcamp's hull ruptured and disappeared inside a rising column of fire, smoke, steel, and cargo. Peanuts, tobacco, twine, bunker fuel, burning fertilizer, and pieces of the vessel were thrown between 2,000 and 3,000 feet into the air. Fireballs crossed the sky over Galveston Bay. Molten fragments fell across the industrial district. The pressure wave flattened buildings close to the harbor and tore roofs and doors from structures farther away. Windows shattered many miles from the port. The shock was reportedly felt hundreds of miles away. At the waterfront, the blast forced water outward and produced a wave approximately 15 feet high. It crashed across docks and flooded low areas. The Longhorn II, a barge in the harbor, was lifted from the water and deposited roughly 100 feet away on land. Railway warehouses were destroyed. Tracks twisted. Cranes collapsed. Vehicles were crushed or thrown. The Monsanto chemical plant, almost beside the Grandcamp, was devastated. Workers inside had only seconds or no warning at all. The city's fire department was positioned directly beside the ship. The chief and all 27 firefighters were killed. The explosion destroyed the equipment Texas City needed most at the exact moment the entire industrial district began to burn. Flaming metal and cargo landed on storage tanks filled with oil and chemicals. Fires broke out across the refinery area. Some tanks ruptured, others burned for days. Secondary explosions followed. Black smoke spread above the city. People who had gathered to watch the fire became casualties in the first instant. Others were struck inside factories, railway buildings, automobiles, houses, and offices. The blast wave moved beyond the port and into residential neighborhoods. Walls cracked, ceilings fell, glass became shrapnel. The explosion damaged nearly every part of Texas City in some way. But the physical destruction was only the beginning of the emergency. The city had lost firefighters, communications, roads, medical capacity, and industrial control at the same time. The harbor was burning. Thousands of people needed help. And another ship, filled with ammonium nitrate, remained beside the ruins. Survivors emerged into a landscape they no longer recognized. Where the Grandcamp and Pier O had stood, there was fire, water, wreckage, and fragments of steel. The sounds of the industrial port were replaced by alarms, collapsing structures, burning fuel, and calls for help. Telephone lines were damaged. Roads were blocked by debris. Railway tracks were destroyed. Cars carrying the injured met crowds moving in the opposite direction. There was no operating hospital in Texas City capable of handling the emergency. Volunteers converted City Hall and the Chamber of Commerce into makeshift treatment centers. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and ordinary residents treated burns, cuts, fractures, shock, and severe blast injuries with whatever supplies were available. The injured were sent toward hospitals in Galveston, Houston, and other nearby communities. Ambulances arrived from across the region. Private cars, trucks, taxis, and buses became emergency transport. Police came from Galveston, Houston, and San Antonio to help maintain order and control traffic. The American Red Cross began coordinating relief. Military and naval units assisted. Aircraft carried medical supplies and evacuated casualties. Yet even as outside help arrived, no one could safely assume the explosions were finished. The High Flyer had been moored close to the Grandcamp. It carried approximately 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate in one hold and about 2,000 tons of sulfur in two others. The first blast tore the ship from its moorings. It drifted toward the Wilson B. Keene, another cargo vessel nearby. The High Flyer's deck and holds were damaged, but the ship had not exploded. Its captain tried to move it away. The anchor could not be raised. After about an hour of effort, the crew abandoned the ship. The burning Grandcamp wreckage and fires throughout the harbor continued to heat the High Flyer. Eventually, it caught fire. Everyone understood what that could mean. Texas City Mayor Curtis Trahan placed railway executive Swede Sandberg in charge of relief operations. When Sandberg learned that the High Flyer was burning, efforts began to tow it away from the docks. The anchor was detached. Tugboats took lines and pulled, but the vessel barely moved. Something beneath or around the ship appeared to hold it in place. The High Flyer had drifted against the Wilson B. Keene, and the damaged harbor was filled with wreckage. The ship remained trapped near piers, grain elevators, warehouses, and burning industrial facilities. This created a second countdown. Unlike the first fire, the danger was now obvious. The city had already seen what ammonium nitrate could do. Rescuers and officials tried to clear the port. Crews withdrew. The area around the High Flyer was evacuated as far as conditions allowed. But moving people through a city filled with debris, casualties, smoke, and active fires was not simple. Throughout the day and into the night, Texas City burned. The sky glowed orange. Storage tanks erupted. Fires spread through damaged plants. Rescue teams searched ruins while knowing that another massive explosion could occur at any time. Families tried to locate missing relatives. Temporary treatment centers filled with the wounded. Bodies were recovered from the port, factories, roads, rail yards, and buildings. The High Flyer remained in the harbor. At 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, approximately 15 hours after the Grandcamp exploded, its ammonium nitrate detonated. The second blast illuminated the night like daylight. It destroyed the High Flyer and demolished the Wilson B. Keene beside it. The pier and nearby grain elevators suffered additional damage. More burning fragments and shrapnel fell across an area already devastated by the first explosion. At least 2 people were killed in the second blast. The number was far lower than it could have been because officials and rescuers had anticipated the explosion and removed nearly everyone from the immediate area. But the High Flyer ensured that the port would remain a burning ruin. The true death toll could never be established with complete certainty. Official and historical sources commonly place the number between 500 and 600. A Texas historical marker records more than 550 dead. Thousands were injured. The uncertainty came from the violence of the explosion and from the nature of the population near the port. Some bodies were badly damaged. Some victims were foreign seamen. Others were temporary or unregistered laborers who did not appear in local census records. Entire groups of workers disappeared at the docks and plants. The work of identification continued for weeks. Texas City's high school gymnasium became a temporary morgue. A local garage was converted into an embalming facility. Around 150 embalmers worked there in the days after the disaster. Dental students helped compare remains with dental records. Some victims were never identified. The disaster affected nearly every family in the city. People had lost relatives, homes, jobs, vehicles, and personal possessions. Industrial plants that employed much of the population were damaged or destroyed. The harbor that had created Texas City's prosperity had become the center of its grief. On April 19th, only 3 days after the first explosion, the city held a memorial service at the high school football stadium. The fires had not yet become a distant memory. Smoke and destruction remained visible, but the community gathered to mourn the dead. The disaster soon became a national story. Newspapers printed photographs of flattened factories, twisted ships, shattered homes, and the remains of the waterfront. Americans saw what appeared to be a city struck by war, even though the destruction had begun with fertilizer prepared for post-war recovery. Federal investigators examined the handling, packaging, storage, and transport of the ammonium nitrate. Chemists and engineers studied the conditions inside the Grandcamp. The exact cause of the first small fire was never conclusively identified, but the investigation determined that the conditions aboard the ship allowed the fertilizer to undergo a catastrophic reaction. The disaster exposed a chain of failures rather than one simple mistake. The cargo had been treated as relatively safe. The bags may have arrived warm. Large quantities were confined inside the ship. The fertilizer was stored near combustible materials and fuel. A fire was allowed to develop beneath stacked bags. The holds were closed. Steam was injected. Spectators were permitted to gather close to the vessel. Nearby factories and ships were not evacuated in time. The city had no disaster plan capable of handling a chemical explosion on this scale. Emergency resources were concentrated directly beside the danger, which killed the firefighters and destroyed their equipment. No one decision created the catastrophe alone. Together, they transformed a cargo fire into the deadliest industrial disaster in the United States. Legal responsibility became complicated. The fertilizer had been manufactured in government-owned plants. Private companies transported it. Railways and port workers handled it. The Grandcamp's officers made decisions aboard the ship. Local authorities managed the emergency. Hundreds of lawsuits followed. In the deadliest case, victims attempted to hold the federal government responsible. The case reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the government in 1953. For many survivors, that ruling deepened the sense that no institution would fully answer for the disaster. Congress later approved compensation legislation. In 1955, approximately $17 million was distributed among nearly 1,400 claimants. The money helped families rebuild, but it could not replace the people who had vanished in the blast. The Texas City disaster forced governments and industries to reconsider ammonium nitrate. New standards addressed how it should be packaged, stored, transported, and separated from reactive materials. Keeping the chemical cool became a central safety requirement. Specialized containers were introduced. Long-distance movement and overseas shipment faced tighter restrictions. The disaster also changed emergency planning. Texas City's refineries created a mutual aid system so industrial facilities could share personnel and equipment during future emergencies. Similar arrangements spread to other industrial areas. Fire departments developed greater awareness of chemical hazards. Ports improved rules for dangerous cargo. Emergency medical planning evolved. The idea that a large industrial complex could rely on a small local response force no longer appeared acceptable. Yet the deeper lesson was not limited to one chemical. Texas City demonstrated what happens when normality hides extreme risk. Every individual element appeared familiar. A cargo ship, fertilizer, a dock fire, a volunteer fire department, spectators watching smoke, a captain attempting to protect his cargo, a city built around industry. But when those elements came together, they produced a disaster no one on the waterfront was prepared to imagine. Texas City rebuilt. Industrial companies returned. Monsanto pledged to reconstruct its plant, and others followed. By 1950, many physical signs of the explosion had disappeared from everyday streets. The port resumed work. Refineries continued to define the local economy. But the disaster remained present in memorials, cemeteries, archives, and family histories. The Grandcamp's anchor, blown away and buried during the explosion, was later recovered and placed in Memorial Park. Unidentified victims were buried nearby. A memorial honors the firefighters who died at the ship. Their loss remains one of the most haunting details of the story. They answered what appeared to be a routine call. They arrived with every truck the city possessed. They stood between the burning ship and the crowd. When the Grandcamp exploded, Texas City lost its entire fire department in a single moment. The people who came to watch the smoke could not know the chemistry unfolding below deck. But the disaster reveals how dangerous that gap can be. The gap between how safe something appears and what it can become under the wrong conditions. The Grandcamp had carried fertilizer meant to restore farmland. The High Flyer carried more fertilizer and sulfur. The port existed to move products that supported cities, farms, and industries. None of those purposes were destructive. But industrial systems do not become safe simply because their purpose is ordinary. They become safe when danger is understood, communicated, regulated, and respected. At 8:25 on the morning of April 16, 1947, Texas City's fire siren sounded. 47 minutes later, the Grandcamp exploded. In that short period, a small hidden fire became a citywide catastrophe. Workers smelled smoke. Men uncovered flames beneath the fertilizer bags. Water and extinguishers failed. The fire department arrived. Ammunition was only partly removed. The hatches were closed. Steam entered the holds. The smoke became brighter. The crowd became larger. And no one created enough distance between the ship and the city. At 9:12, the Grandcamp ceased to exist. 15 hours later, the high flyer followed it. Between those two explosions, Texas City experienced fire, flood, industrial collapse, mass casualties, and the destruction of its emergency services. More than 500 people died. Thousands were wounded. The exact total remains uncertain because some victims disappeared so completely that no official count could include them with confidence. The catastrophe did not begin with the explosion. It began with assumptions. The assumption that ammonium nitrate was safe enough to handle like ordinary cargo. The assumption that steam would control the fire. The assumption that a familiar dock fire could not destroy a city. The assumption that spectators could stand close and remain safe. The assumption that there would be time to react if conditions became worse. By the time everyone understood the true danger, the Grandcamp was already a bomb. Today, photographs from Texas City show a ship covered in smoke, firefighters holding hoses, and crowds standing nearby. They are difficult to look at because we know what the people inside those images did not. We know that the explosion is minutes away. We know the fire trucks will disappear. We know the dock will be erased. We know another ship will explode before the following morning. And we know that the people watching the smoke are not witnessing the beginning of a fire. They are standing inside the final moments before one of the worst industrial disasters in history.